Why do you think we're such a violent nation?
Well,
That's a broad question.
I think that was just a different time. It was a time
You
when
don't think
people...
we're violent now?
Well, I think we are violent in some ways, but people generally handled things in a little bit more of a violent way.
Frontier.
The frontier experience, but also, I don't like what you said and I'm going to smack you over the head with my cane was something that happened much more frequently than it does today. It was just part of the way that society worked. I'm sure not just in the United States, but everywhere in the world.
What other nasty confrontations were there? Maybe not for caning, but there must have been some rivalries that got pretty nasty nonetheless. Were there others besides the two of these?
Oh, there were plenty. There were people from both the North and South who fought. There's sort of people often think that the South is really the violent area, but the North is just as violent. There are always politicians from the North who are getting into all kinds of trouble with each other. One of my favorite stories is of two politicians from the North who run into each other on the street, and one of them says good morning, and the other one sort of says, I don't want to speak to you, which makes the first guy pretty angry, and they end up throwing bricks at each other and hiding behind lamp posts in the street so that they can avoid getting hit by the incoming bricks. And this was just a pretty common thing. This happened in the floor of the House frequently, people throwing crackers at each other, and there's a great experience where there's a big fight on the floor of the House, and Alexander Stephens, the future vice president of the Confederacy, is watching, and he notices that somebody takes a swing at another guy, and that guy's toupee goes flying, and this causes everyone to go into fits of laughter because they didn't even know he wore a toupee. So, this kind of thing was sort of part of the regular experience of Washington, and it happened not just in the streets, but also on the floor of the House.
So that society sometimes did break down.
It did, yeah.
But then again, there were others trying to do other things, and one that you speak of a bit and has our man in it, Mr. Lincoln, was the Young Indian Club.
That's right.
Lincoln was there from 47 through 49, one
right.
term. And this was really a cross-sectional club.
It was.
As you talk about it in detail. And I think Lincoln would have been very comfortable in a cross-sectional milieu.
He was,
because he came from a border state,
That's right.
Central Illinois.
That's right.
Central Illinois is a border state. And he saw everything, all sorts of political stripes. And through his political wanderings, his circuit wanderings, he learned what was out there.
Yeah.
And how to deal with it, perhaps, so that he immediately gravitated with your Alexander Stephens
That's right.
to this same club. Tell us a bit about this.
One of the things that I think is sort of lore about Lincoln is that when he came to Washington, he was this amazing speaker who got up on the floor of the House and gave these speeches that mesmerized everyone who was there. And this was not true. This was actually...
You're breaking my heart.
I know. He got up on the floor of Congress pretty quickly. Within a few weeks of coming to Washington, he gave the very famous spot resolutions, which were about the Mexican War. But not that many people heard them. Those politicians who didn't spend a lot of time listening to their fellow congressmen who were speaking on the floor of the House, they didn't listen to Lincoln any more than they listened to anyone else, particularly because he was a freshman politician. He was not someone that everybody knew. He was so not well known in Washington that when he came and took his seat for the first time, the reporter who was recording who was sitting where did not record his choice. They didn't know who he was. So he was not well known. He gave a speech that was listened to by some people, but a lot of people not so much. And I think Lincoln was a very smart guy. He learned that it wasn't very effective. He learned that what he was doing, getting up and giving a speech in the House, was not effective. And so he started to look elsewhere for a way to make his mark, for a way to get involved in the politics of the Whig Party, which he was very much a part of. And so one of the places that he looked was this Young Indian Club. It was a group of politicians that talked a lot about the issues of the day, the politics of the day, and he quickly gravitated to it, I think because it was a very free exchange of ideas, and because one of the things they cared most about was to nominate Zachary Taylor as the next president from the Whig Party. And there was a small group that was interested in this, not just the Young Indian Club, there were others, but the Young Indian Club was very much dedicated to this. So he started to meet with these people, and it was a cross-sectional club, as you mentioned. It was Lincoln. It was a senior member of the Senate by the name of Truman Smith. He was sort of involved in the party machinery, was very well known. Those were the two Northerners, and there were 5 Southerners, 3 freshman congressmen from Virginia, and 2 senior congressmen from Georgia. Alexander Stephens, the future vice president of the Confederacy, and Robert Toombs, who was a good friend of Stephens. And so they began to get together, the 7 of them, and talk about strategy and argue and get involved in sort of the issues of the day and push to get this recognized in Congress. And this is where Lincoln really made his mark. He was able to get a lot of support from people who you would be surprised would be interested in Zachary Taylor, in part because he was part of this group. So he went back to his boarding house at the end of the day and talked to them, the people at the boarding house, about why don't you support Zachary Taylor. This was his moment. This was his ability to work in a group and get something accomplished, and it's exactly what happened.
And he actually became a leader of a movement, and that is to stop the nationalization of slavery.
That's true.
And you begin your book with the Wilmot Proviso.
That's right.
Tell us very briefly what it is, very briefly what the Wilmot Proviso is.
The Wilmot Proviso was an amendment to a bill to help fund the Mexican War. So the president at the time, James K. Polk, put forward a bill in the House in 1846 asking for money to basically end the Mexican War, and a fellow by the name of David Wilmot from Pennsylvania stood up and gave this little amendment called the Wilmot Proviso that stipulated that any territory that the United States would acquire in the Mexican War would be free of slavery. And this became one of the biggest controversies in American history in this period between North and South. People were enraged about it.
So, I just gave away the bottom line. He became the movement's leader, really. They were trying to stop him, him staying with that issue as president-elect, for heaven's sakes.
Lincoln, yes.
Yeah, and he stood against it. That was the one thing, principle, he would not abide breaking through. So, how did the Wilmot Proviso, do you think, affect him at that moment and later? Was that a spark for him?
I don't think so. I think one of the things about Lincoln is that when he came to Washington, which is right after this controversy begins to take off, he understood very quickly that the Wilmot Proviso was not going to pass through Congress. And so in this period, got to step back for a second and recognize that in 1847 and 1848, nobody knew that the Civil War was going to come in 1861. So I think Lincoln was not as concerned. I think he understood that this was a problem and that it was going to need to be solved, but I think when he came to Washington, this was not particularly his agenda. He was much more interested in the Whig perspective at this point, trying to elect a Whig leader as the next president.
It's interesting. At the same time, Jim McPherson and I sat here and we've had this discussion a little bit about was that war inevitable? And Jim was telling me how Lincoln never really came up with that, because I came up with the Robertson letter in this period in '46 that he said to him, "I don't think slavery can be stopped without war."
Yeah.
It's the only time he said that.
Yeah.
Now I think again, as a son of a psychoanalyst, that this is the one moment he actually became true. He revealed himself to someone. Otherwise, and that was private, and he couldn't do it otherwise out there, else he never would get anywhere. So I thought that Lincoln, and I still kind of think that Lincoln in the back of his head felt war was inevitable.
It's possible that he thought war was inevitable if you were going to try to end slavery right away. But as we know, Lincoln talked a lot about ending slavery very far off in the future, right?
And that meant the stopping of
You had to
nationalization.
stop slavery from expanding, but he believed that the Republican Party could do that. And that's what he was elected on, right? The platform of the Republican Party said we are going to stop the expansion of slavery. So I think it's possible he thought that at that moment, but then by the time he became part of the Republican Party, he had committed himself to solving the issue through politics.
Yet he was ready for the war to come.
He was ready for the war to come. And certainly you could make the argument that he wanted it to come.